The sound of rain at night knocked on the door like a racing heartbeat. James opened the door to find a young woman, soaking wet, visibly pregnant, trembling hands clutching a thick envelope. Her expensive designer shoes were caked with mud, a diamond watch peeking out from under her torn hoodie. Her eyes were panicked like a hunted animal. "I need to rent a room. 3 months up front. Cash." Her voice trembled, yet carried something familiar with giving orders. Inside the envelope were crisp $100 bills, more than James's entire year of rent payments. "Don't you have anyone with you? Family? A husband?" The girl flinched as if she'd been slapped. Don't ask about them." "Please don't." Her eyes darted behind James's back, as if someone was lurking in the shadows. Why would a pregnant woman with money be alone in the rain at night like a fugitive? Whether to agree or not, James turned to look at his son before making his decision. James Hamilton had learned to expect the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. Standing in his doorway at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, water dripping from her dark hair onto his worn welcome mat, was a puzzle wrapped in desperation. The contrast between her expensive accessories and her desperate demeanor sent warning bells through his mind, but something deeper, perhaps the memory of his own darkest moments, made him step aside. "Come in," he heard himself say, watching as relief flooded her features so intensely it was almost painful to witness. His 8-year-old son Tyler appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Dad? Who's that?" The innocence in his voice cut through the tension like a knife. James had spent 3 years protecting Tyler from the harsh realities of their financial struggles, from the endless stack of overdue bills, from the knowledge that they were always one emergency away from losing everything. Now, here was an emergency of a different kind, standing in their living room, and James found himself making a decision that would change everything. "Tyler, go back to bed, buddy. Everything's okay." But as he watched the mysterious woman's eyes fill with tears at the sight of his son, James wondered if anything would ever be okay again. The woman introduced herself simply as Adriana, offering no last name, no explanation for the fear that seemed to emanate from her very pores. She paid the 3 months' rent without negotiation, her hands steady despite their earlier trembling, and James noticed how she counted the bills with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to handling large sums of money. When he showed her to the small spare room, Tyler's former playroom that he'd reluctantly converted when the bills became too overwhelming, she nodded with the same quiet desperation she'd shown at the door. "This is perfect," she whispered, though the room contained nothing more than a single bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto the neighbor's chain-link fence. That first night, James lay awake listening to the soft sounds coming from the room next door. Not crying, which he'd expected, but something else. The rustle of papers, whispered phone conversations that ended abruptly, the creak of floorboards as she paced despite her condition. When morning came, he found her in the kitchen at dawn, fully dressed, sitting at his small table with a cup of coffee and a prenatal vitamin in her palm. She'd made breakfast, not the simple eggs and toast he might have expected, but perfectly prepared eggs Benedict with hollandaise sauce that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in years. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the expensive ingredients that definitely hadn't come from his nearly empty refrigerator. I picked up a few things. The few things turned out to be enough groceries to feed a family of 6 for a month, all high-end brands that James recognized from the commercials but had never imagined buying. Organic this, artisanal that, the kind of food that belonged in a different world entirely. When Tyler came downstairs and saw the feast spread across their scratched table, his eyes went wide with the kind of wonder James hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. "Are we rich now, Dad?" Tyler asked with the brutal honesty of childhood, and James felt his face burn with embarrassment, even as Adriana smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. For the next few days, an odd routine developed. Adriana would disappear for hours at a time, returning with shopping bags full of things they didn't need but somehow couldn't refuse. New clothes for Tyler, fresh flowers for the kitchen table, books and games that transformed their bare living room into something that felt like a home again. She cooked elaborate meals with the kind of skill that suggested professional training, helped Tyler with homework in a way that revealed an education far beyond what James had expected, and always paid for everything in cash without ever explaining where the money came from. But it was the small things that puzzled James most. The way she held her phone like it might explode at any moment. The way she flinched whenever a car door slammed outside. The way she would sometimes stop mid-sentence and listen to sounds that James couldn't hear. Most telling of all was how she never received mail, never gave anyone their address, and insisted on answering the door herself whenever someone knocked, which happened with increasing frequency as men in expensive suits began appearing at random hours, asking questions about someone matching Adriana's description. Tyler, with the uncomplicated acceptance of childhood, had already decided that Adriana was the best thing that had happened to them in years. He would sit with her for hours, chattering about school and friends and the things that mattered in an 8-year-old's world, while she listened with the kind of attention that suggested she'd never heard a child speak before. "She's really smart, Dad," Tyler told James one evening as they watched her help him build an elaborate Lego castle. "She knows about everything, even the hard math stuff." James nodded, but privately wondered what kind of education produced someone who could explain advanced calculus to a second grader while simultaneously planning escape routes from their own life. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, when James returned home early from his construction job to find a black sedan parked across the street and 2 men in dark suits standing on his front porch. Through the window, he could see Adriana pressed against the far wall of the living room, her face pale with terror that was almost palpable. Tyler was at school, thank God, but James felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. These weren't bill collectors or city inspectors. These were predators, and somehow his home had become their hunting ground. "Can I help you?" James asked as he approached his own front door, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority he'd learned in his years managing construction crews. The men turned, and he saw immediately that they weren't here for conversation. "We're looking for someone," the taller one said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "A young woman." Pregnant. She might be using a false name. James felt his jaw tighten as he realized that Adriana, whatever her real name might be, hadn't just been running from family problems or an abusive boyfriend. She'd been running from something much bigger, much more dangerous, and she'd brought that danger directly into his home, directly into Tyler's world. "I don't know anyone like that," James lied smoothly, surprising himself with how easily the deception came. The shorter man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made James's skin crawl. "That's interesting, Mr. Hamilton, because our sources suggest otherwise. We're prepared to make it worth your while to cooperate." They mentioned a sum of money that made James's knees weak, enough to pay off every debt, to secure Tyler's future, to give them the kind of life James had only dreamed about since his wife's death. All he had to do was tell them about the pregnant woman living in his spare room. For a moment that stretched like eternity, James stood frozen between two impossible choices. Through the window, he could see Adriana's terrified face, could see the way she pressed one protective hand against her belly while the other reached for something in her purse, probably pepper spray, probably useless against men like these. In that moment, James understood that whatever Adriana was running from, it was worse than anything he could imagine. The money they were offering, the casual way they'd mentioned Tyler's school schedule, the fact that they knew his name, these weren't people who made idle threats. "I told you, I don't know anyone like that," James repeated, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Now get off my property before I call the police." The men exchanged glances, and James saw something shift in their expressions. They weren't angry. They were impressed, as if he'd passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. "Very well, Mr. Hamilton. But we'll be watching. And when you change your mind, and you will change your mind, you know how to reach us." They left a business card on his doorstep, expensive white stock with nothing but a phone number embossed in gold. That evening, after Tyler had gone to bed, James and Adriana sat at the kitchen table in the kind of silence that demanded truth. She'd been crying, not the theatrical tears of someone trying to manipulate him, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden for too long. "I should leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never should have come here. I never should have put you and Tyler at risk." James studied her face in the dim light from the overhead fixture, but his mind kept drifting to the business card still sitting on his counter, to the sum of money those men had mentioned, to the crushing weight of bills that seemed to multiply faster than he could pay them. "I almost gave you up today," he said suddenly, the confession tearing out of him like a physical wound. "When they offered me the money, for about 30 seconds, I actually considered it." Adriana went very still, and James forced himself to meet her eyes. "I was going to tell them you were upstairs." I started to say the words. The shame burned in his throat, but he pushed forward. "My wife's medical bills, Tyler's future, the house, everything I've been drowning in for 3 years. They offered me enough to fix all of it." Adriana was quiet for a long moment, and James prepared himself for anger, for disgust, for her to pack her bags and disappear into the night. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "But you didn't," she said softly. "You could have, but you didn't. That's what matters." James shook his head, frustrated with himself, with the situation, with the way desperation could make even decent people spend sleepless nights weighing terrible options. "It shouldn't have been a choice. It shouldn't have taken me 2 days to remember who I want to be. I kept picking up that card, putting it down, picking it up again. Yesterday morning I actually dialed half the number before I hung up." "James," Adriana said, her voice gentle but firm, "you think I haven't been making impossible choices every day for months? You think I haven't wondered if I should just go back, accept their terms, let them control my life if it means my baby has everything money can buy?" She shifted in her chair, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "The difference between us and them isn't that we don't have dark thoughts. It's that we don't act on them when it matters most. "Who are you?" he asked, not accusingly, but with the gentle persistence of someone who needed to understand. Adriana closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, James saw a different person entirely. Not the frightened girl who'd appeared at his door, but someone with steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. "My name is Adriana Blackwell," she said. And even James, who didn't follow society news or business headlines, recognized the name. The Blackwell family owned half the city's real estate, had their fingers in everything from construction to politics to the kind of old money that bought influence instead of objects. "I'm the daughter they don't talk about," Adriana continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "The one who asked too many questions, who wanted to use the family money for something other than making more money. When I got pregnant, they saw an opportunity. Not a grandchild, but a tool. Someone they could control, mold, use to extend their influence for another generation." She placed both hands on her belly, protective and defiant. "They want to take my baby away from me the moment it's born. Legal guardianship, they call it. Temporary custody while I recover from postpartum depression I don't have. And once they have custody, I'll never see my child again." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The men in suits weren't law enforcement or private investigators. They were fixers, the kind of people the Blackwell family kept on retainer to solve problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. Adriana wasn't just running from her family. She was running from a system designed to grind up inconvenient people and spit out compliant ones. "The father?" James asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Adriana's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Paid off and relocated. A very generous settlement in exchange for signing away all parental rights. I found out later he was married the entire time, one of their junior executives, perfectly positioned to play the role of devoted boyfriend, until he wasn't needed anymore." James felt a rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that came from recognizing real evil dressed up in expensive suits and legal documents. These people had taken everything from Adriana, her family, her identity, the father of her child, even her name, and they wanted to take the one thing she had left. "So you ran," he said, and she nodded. 3 months ago. I've been moving from place to place, paying cash, trying to stay invisible until the baby comes. I thought I could hide until I turned 25 and gained access to my trust fund. But they found me anyway. They always find me. The next morning brought crisis in the form of a legal document slipped under James's door while he slept. A restraining order filed by the Blackwell family against Jane Doe and Associates, prohibiting any pregnant woman matching Adriana's description from coming within 500 feet of James's property. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was clear. They knew exactly where she was, and they were tightening the noose. "How is this even legal?" James demanded, reading the document for the 3rd time, while Adriana packed her few belongings with mechanical efficiency. "It's not," Adriana replied, her voice hollow. "But they have judges in their pocket, and I'm just a mentally unstable young woman who's been evading the family trying to help her. That's the story they tell anyway." She folded her expensive maternity clothes, the only outward sign of her wealth she'd kept, with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to carry her entire life in a single suitcase. "They'll fight this in court later, after they have what they want. The restraining order is just theater, a way to make their eventual actions look legal and necessary." Tyler chose that moment to come downstairs for breakfast, his 8-year-old face bright with the kind of optimism that hadn't yet learned to expect disappointment. "Are we having pancakes again?" he asked, looking hopefully at Adriana, who'd been spoiling him with elaborate breakfasts since her arrival. The smile she gave him was heartbreaking in its forced cheerfulness. "Not today, sweetheart. I have to go away for a while." Tyler's face fell, and James felt his heart crack a little more. "But you'll come back, right? You'll come back when the baby's born?" The silence that followed was deafening. Adriana knelt down to Tyler's level, her hands gentle on his shoulders, and James saw her struggle with what to say. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from? How do you make an 8-year-old understand that money and power can twist justice into something unrecognizable? "I hope so, Tyler," she said finally. "I really, really hope so." That afternoon, as Adriana prepared to disappear back into whatever underground network of safe houses and false names she'd been navigating, James made a decision that surprised even him. "No," he said, the word coming out with more force than he'd intended. "You're not leaving. They want to play games with legal documents and intimidation tactics. Fine. Let's play." Adriana stared at him as if he'd lost his mind, which he probably had. "James, you don't understand what you're dealing with. These people destroy anyone who gets in their way. They have resources you can't imagine." "Maybe," James replied, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. "But they made one mistake. They threatened my family." His call was answered on the second ring by Rebecca Martinez, a legal aid attorney he'd worked with during his darkest financial period. "Rebecca." "It's James Hamilton. I need a favor. A big one." What followed was the kind of conversation that changes everything. Rapid-fire explanations, requests for emergency injunctions, the mobilization of sources that James didn't even know existed in the world of public interest law. Rebecca arrived 2 hours later with a briefcase full of legal documents and a fire in her eyes that matched James's own. She was a small woman with graying hair and the kind of quiet intensity that came from decades of fighting David and Goliath battles in family court. "Adriana Blackwell," she said without preamble, settling into James's kitchen chair like she was preparing for war. "I've been waiting years for someone in your family to ask for help. The stories I could tell you about your relatives would curl your hair." What Rebecca revealed over the next 3 hours painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond what James had imagined. The Blackwell family had a history of using mental health commitments, financial manipulation, and custody battles to control inconvenient family members. Adriana wasn't the first to run. She was just the first to run while pregnant, which gave them a legal hook they'd never had before. "The good news," Rebecca said, spreading documents across the table, "is that they've gotten overconfident. This restraining order is so obviously fraudulent that any honest judge will throw it out. The bad news is finding an honest judge." The legal battle that followed was unlike anything James had ever experienced. Rebecca worked 18-hour days, filing motions and emergency appeals, while James found himself testifying in depositions about Adriana's character, her fitness as a future mother, her right to make her own choices about her pregnancy, and her life. The Blackwell family pushed back with the full weight of their resources. Character assassination attempts, financial pressure on Rebecca's firm, even anonymous threats that made James grateful Tyler was spending afternoons at his friend's house. But something unexpected happened during those weeks of legal warfare. The story began to leak to the press, not through any action on their part, but through courthouse gossip and the kind of whispered conversations that happen when lawyers recognize genuine injustice. A pregnant heiress held prisoner by her own family, a working-class single father risking everything to protect a stranger. A legal system twisted to serve the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It was the kind of story that wrote itself, and soon reporters were camping outside James's house while his phone rang with interview requests from news outlets he'd only seen on television. Adriana handled the media attention with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She gave measured interviews about family control and reproductive rights, about the difference between being rich and being free, about the responsibility that comes with privilege. "I could have stayed silent," she told one reporter, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I could have accepted their terms, lived in a golden cage, let them raise my child according to their values instead of mine. But what kind of mother would that make me? What kind of example would that set?" The turning point came during a custody hearing that should have been routine. The Blackwell family's attorneys had prepared what they thought was an airtight case, testimony from family physicians about Adriana's mental instability, financial experts who questioned her ability to provide for a child without family support, character witnesses who painted her as a rebellious daughter who'd always been a problem. But Rebecca had prepared something they hadn't expected: the truth. She called witness after witness who testified to Adriana's intelligence, her kindness, her determination to build something meaningful with her life. Tyler took the stand, a decision that terrified James, but one that Tyler had insisted on making, and spoke with the devastating honesty of childhood about how Adriana had made their house feel like a home again. "She teaches me things," Tyler said, his young voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "And she listens when I talk. She's going to be a really good mom." But the most powerful testimony came from Adriana herself, taking the stand in her simple maternity dress, her dark hair pulled back in a modest bun. She spoke with quiet dignity about her dreams for her child, her plans for the future, her understanding of what real wealth meant. "My family taught me that money is power," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "But James and Tyler taught me that love is strength. I want my child to know both, but if I have to choose, I choose love every time." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The restraining order was thrown out as fraudulent, the custody petition was denied, and the Blackwell family was ordered to cease all contact with Adriana until after the birth of her child. More importantly, the judge's written opinion included language about family autonomy and reproductive rights that would be cited in cases for years to come. Walking out of that courthouse, Adriana free and safe for the first time in months, James felt like they'd won more than a legal battle. They'd won the right to choose their own definition of family. The birth of Adriana's daughter 3 weeks later was a moment of pure joy that James hadn't expected to be part of. He and Tyler waited in the hospital corridor while Rebecca handled the legal paperwork that would ensure no one could challenge Adriana's parental rights. When they were finally allowed into the room, James saw something in Adriana's face that had been missing all those months. Peace. She looked like someone who'd found her way home after a long journey through hostile territory. "Her name is Hope," Adriana said, cradling the tiny bundle with the kind of reverence usually reserved for miracles. Hope Hamilton Blackwell. James felt his breath catch in his throat. Hamilton. Adriana smiled, the kind of smile that changed everything. She needs a middle name, and Hamilton sounds perfect. After all, you're family now. Tyler peered over the edge of the hospital bed, with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing a baby for the first time. She's really small, he whispered. But she's really loud. The months that followed brought changes that none of them had anticipated. Adriana's trust fund, which she finally gained access to on her 25th birthday, wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something bigger. She'd learned things during her months of hiding, insights about poverty and struggle and the way systems failed people who needed help most. I want to do something, she told James one evening as they watched Tyler teach Hope to stack blocks on the living room floor. Something that matters. What she created was revolutionary in its simplicity, a foundation that provided legal aid, safe housing, and financial support for people trapped in family situations like her own. Not just wealthy families, but anyone whose relatives used power, financial, legal, or emotional, to control and manipulate. The Hamilton House, as it came to be known, became a beacon for people who needed help escaping situations where love had been twisted into a weapon. James found his own calling in the Foundation's work, his construction background proving invaluable as they renovated buildings to house their programs, his experience with Tyler giving him insights into the children caught in the crossfire of family conflicts. Rebecca became their chief legal counsel, leading a team of attorneys who specialized in cases where the legal system had failed the most vulnerable. And Tyler, growing up surrounded by stories of people who'd found the courage to change their lives, developed the kind of empathy and social consciousness that would guide him for the rest of his life. But perhaps the most important change was the quietest one. James and Adriana, thrown together by crisis and bound by mutual respect, discovered that their partnership extended beyond legal battles and shared purpose. It started with small moments, conversations that lasted long after Tyler had gone to bed, shared looks across the dinner table when Hope did something particularly amusing, the comfortable silence that settled between them during late-night feeding sessions. Love, when it finally came, arrived not with dramatic declarations, but with the gradual realization that they'd built something worth keeping. James proposed on a Thursday evening while they were reviewing foundation budgets at the kitchen table, Tyler doing homework beside them, and Hope sleeping in her carrier nearby. "This is us," he said, gesturing to the scene around them. The mundane miracle of family life, the beautiful chaos of people who'd chosen each other. This is what I want for the rest of my life. Their wedding 6 months later was small and perfect, held in the garden behind Hamilton House, with Tyler as ring-bearer and Hope as the world's youngest flower girl. The guest list included former clients of the foundation, legal aid attorneys, construction workers from James's old crew, and exactly 0 members of the Blackwell family. Adriana wore her grandmother's dress, the only family heirloom she'd managed to take with her when she ran, and James wore the suit Tyler had helped him pick out. Not expensive, but chosen with love. In his wedding speech, James talked about the night a stranger had knocked on his door in the rain, how he'd thought he was just offering shelter for a few nights, and how he'd ended up finding the missing piece of his family. "I thought I was saving her," he said, looking at Adriana with the kind of wonder that never quite faded. "Turns out she was saving us." 5 years later, the Hamilton family has grown in ways none of them could have predicted. Tyler, now 13 and impossibly proud of his little sister, has become the Foundation's unofficial youth ambassador, speaking to groups about the importance of chosen family and the courage it takes to build something new from the ashes of what came before. Hope, at 5, has her mother's intelligence and her stepfather's steady strength, plus a security that comes from being raised by people who understand the difference between love and control. The Foundation has helped hundreds of families, its model copied in cities across the country, its legal victories creating precedents that protect vulnerable people from the very systems meant to help them. And James, who once thought his life was over when his first wife died, has learned that some endings are really beginnings in disguise, that sometimes the best thing you can do is open your door when someone needs shelter from the storm. The Blackwell family, for their part, eventually found other ways to channel their need for control, though they never stopped watching from a distance. Adriana's father died 2 years after Hope's birth. His final letter to his daughter, a mixture of regret and stubborn pride that she read once and then filed away. Her mother sends birthday cards that Adriana opens but doesn't answer. Acknowledgements of a granddaughter she chose not to know. But perhaps the most telling measure of how far they've all come is the tradition they started on the anniversary of that rainy night when everything changed. Every year on that date they open their doors to anyone who needs shelter, who's running from something or searching for something or simply needs a place to belong for a while. It's not a grand gesture or a media event, just a quiet acknowledgement that home isn't a place you're born into, but something you build with the people who choose to stay. James often thinks about the moment when he stood in his doorway, looking at a desperate young woman with expensive shoes and frightened eyes, trying to decide whether to trust his instincts or protect his safety. He thinks about how close he came to choosing fear over compassion, how easily he could have missed the chance to become the person he was meant to be. And he's grateful every single day that when faced with someone else's crisis, he chose to open his door instead of his wallet, his heart instead of his fears. Because in the end, that's what changed everything. Not the money or the legal victories or the Foundation's success, but the simple decision to see Adriana not as a problem to be solved, but as a person deserving of dignity and choice. Everything else followed from that moment of recognition, that instant when James looked past the contradictions and saw the truth. That sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones who need help the most, and sometimes the best thing you can give someone isn't what they're asking for, but what they never dared to hope they could have. Today, when people ask James what he learned from that experience, he always gives the same answer, that family isn't about blood or law or money, but about the people who show up for each other when it matters most, and that sometimes, when you think you're saving someone else, you're really saving yourself.